another exchange of firepower overnight, the Americans firing on Iran, Iran hitting targets in Bahrain and Kuwait. The attacks follow President Trump's U-turn on his decision to charge a 20% toll on all cargo flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. In the last few hours, the president said he'll bomb power plants and bridges until Iran return to peace talks. We're joined now by Arieh Kovler, a journalist based in Jerusalem. Good morning.
Good morning.
I mean, to row back on this idea of a 20% toll on travelling through the Strait is really quite something. But President Trump has upped his game once again by talking about bombing power plants and bridges.
Yeah, it looks, I think it looks like this because it is, like someone without really any plan, scrabbling for anything that will stick, you know? One morning we're talking about a 20% toll on essentially oil, right? And the next day we're into talking about, that's gone, but now we're going to go back to bombing bridges again, maybe bombing power plants again, all the civilian infrastructure that was the big threat at the end of the last part of the war in April, and that was the threat that really led the regional powers to say, you've got to stop this. That would lead to a massive escalation. It just, again, seems like a leader flailing for a solution.
And in terms of that solution, people have been pointing towards the continuing peace talks. We do have a memorandum of understanding, but it is only very basic. I mean, where are those talks right now, and what's the reality that they will result in anything tangible?
There are reports that there are still indirect talks happening by Pakistan and via Qatar. Qatar having a more prominent role than it did in the past. But it's not clear that this memorandum of understanding means anything now. Neither side is keeping to any of the things that they supposedly understood in it. This whole series of escalations was started because Iran decided to start attacking ships inside the Strait of Hormuz. That was an Iranian breach. But following that breach, the US has said, okay, well, clearly nothing in here in this memorandum is binding on us either. Almost everything that's been agreed in it by both sides is no longer being kept. And we may have to go back to the drawing board. I think there's a sense amongst the Iranian leadership that, the Americans can't be trusted. They promised they would stop the war, and they haven't stopped it. On the American side, they could say with some justification, we promised we'd stop the war, but that doesn't mean we can't strike back if you bomb ships. I don't know what happens now.
And where is Benjamin Netanyahu? Where are the Israelis in this? Because, they have been very involved, and there's been a lot of conversation between Israel and America about the direction of travel and what is the right thing to do here. What's the view of the Israeli government?
I think, look, Iran says it treats Israel and the US as if they're kind of one entity in this war. That clearly isn't true. Iran has not hit Israeli targets as a result of these US bombings in these last couple of weeks. And Israel has not got involved in joining the bombing campaign either. In Israel, the Knesset's about to dissolve. We're heading towards an election season over the summer. Netanyahu is eager to show that he's winning. I think Israelis are not keen to spend the summer in bomb shelters again, frankly. But at the same time, there's obviously a certain sense of satisfaction amongst Netanyahu and the Israeli government. The deal that Israelis saw as a surrender to Iran is not holding, and that this conflict has resumed. Iran seems somewhat deterred from dragging Israel into this. They don't want another round of Israeli bombings on top of what they're currently suffering.
Yeah, there does seem to be a hesitation when it comes to that broader conflict. We'll see where it goes next. Arieh, thank you very much.
For the fourth day in a row, Iran and the United States have both carried out attacks around the Strait of Hormuz. At 9 o'clock this evening, US Central Command confirmed that a naval blockade is now being reinforced on Iran's ports. The US say there are currently more than 20 of their Navy warships and hundreds of military aircraft operating across the region. President Trump, though, has rowed back on his threat to impose a 20% fee on all cargo passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Instead, he said Gulf countries are going to invest in the US. He's been speaking at the White House today during a news conference with the Iraqi Prime Minister.
I put it out yesterday. I thought it was good. I was called by different people, different countries, kings and emirs and all of the people that we all know and we all love, and they've been very strong partners. And they said, we'd love to do it a different way. We'd love to invest in the United States with billions and billions of dollars and continue our record setting, because there's never been a time like this for the United States, with the factories, with the plants, with everything else. And we would like to invest tremendously in the United States as opposed to charging a fee. And I like that, actually, because I don't think anybody should be able to charge a fee for the Strait or for any other Strait relationship.
Well, let's talk to Mick Mulroy, former US Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East under President Trump. Good evening to you, Mick.
Good evening, Carole. Good to be back with you.
Great to have you with us. Let's start with what appears to be escalating violence. Another night when both Iran and the United States have been carrying out attacks. The US reimposes its blockade. I mean, how serious do you think is the deterioration here?
So, Carole, I think it's pretty much absolute when it comes to the memorandum of understanding, which obviously wasn't any understanding the way we thought it was. There wasn't a meeting of mind, and most of the provisions starting with what does it mean to have an open Strait of Hormuz? Obviously, the Iranians believe that meant they control it, and if you don't follow their guidance, they fire upon you. And that's not, I don't think, anybody's definition of open. So I think right now we're at a situation where the U.S. is going to systematically try to degrade the Iranian capacity to keep the Strait closed. And depending on how that works, if it doesn't, they're probably going to escalate and go up the ladder, hitting infrastructure targets until they can put a lot of pressure on the regime to hopefully change their perspective on that.
Because the difficulty that the US faces here is that, and this is something we've talked about before, that for all the overwhelming strength of US forces, the Iranians only have to carry out relatively minor attacks on shipping to disrupt the flow of trade through the Strait of Hormuz. And indeed, it was attacks like that which seem to have started this latest spiral of violence.
That's right. So if they threaten, and they obviously are willing to shoot at these commercial vessels, which are pretty much defenseless, then the insurers are not going to pay to insure them as they try to transit the strait. So they only need to show minimal amount of force to really close down the strait itself. And I think it's pretty clear that the U.S., although we'll certainly use air and missile firepower, we're not willing to put ground forces on the ground in Iranian territory to force open the strait. So we're kind of at this impasse. It might actually get there as we systematically go through these targets to give them the ability to control it. But that is something I think Iran is betting on. They would rather control the Strait of Hormuz and get the benefits that they were about to get if they would have just followed the memorandum of understanding.
The whole point of this was the US and its allies, for that matter, saying that the Strait of Hormuz should be open for all shipping. And that is something which the Gulf states themselves very strongly support. I mean, when you see that context, was it a mistake for President Trump ever to threaten, as he did only yesterday, this 20% fee that would be levied on any tanker going through the Strait of Hormuz? He made that threat. Presumably there was an absolute outcry, which is why he's changed his mind on it again today.
Yes, that was surprising considering every one of his cabinet members, from the Secretary of State, Defense, Treasury, the Vice President, had all made the argument, I think correctly, that this is an international waterway and there's no country that should be able to charge a toll to simply pass through it. Not the United States, not Iran. So I think that's one of the reasons why President Trump did an about face on that, because he heard pretty clearly that that not only is not likely to happen, I don't know the legal basis for how that would happen, but it would undermine our argument that Iran shouldn't control it. And so Iran's using that statement, of course, to support their ability to control it as they are adjacent to it. But ultimately, it's an international waterway under the UN, and it should remain that way.
The US is confirming that it has now reimposed the blockade on Iran's ports. I mean, that is something that will exert quite significant pressure on the already troubled economy of Iran.
It will, and it was. Before, it was having an impact. I think the United States perhaps thought it was having more of an impact and that the MOU would be more binding and under the auspices that they believed it was. So this going back into place is not something that the regime wants to see, especially if the U.S. still goes after these railway targets that we saw them start with. That could cut out a lot of the ground logistical routes that the Iranians use, both to resupply militarily and for their economy. If they can cut out the maritime and the ground portion, at least degrade it substantially, that's going to have a significant impact on the Iranian regime's ability to raise money to operate.
Where does all of this leave that memorandum of understanding? I mean, there were doubts from the moment that it was signed, but the idea was that you would have a 60-day ceasefire, and that would allow negotiations on all these highly contentious issues, instead of which, long before we've got to any significant, meaningful negotiations on any of the very difficult differences that there are, it seems as though the whole thing has broken down. I mean, is that MOU, is there any way of getting back to that?
I don't think so, because ultimately neither side agreed on what the provisions actually meant. So unless there's some change in perspective, which is only going to come by military pressure, economic pressure, and political pressure by the U.S. and our partners against the regime in Tehran, there's no reason to go back to the MOU. They simply don't agree on what the terms mean. They think, for example, the Strait means they own it and they can charge a fee at the end of the 60-day negotiation, which is completely over right now. So I think if this does get back to a diplomatic effort, and hopefully it does, that it needs to be much more clearly defined. Just like you'd expect, like what's the definition of open, for example, so that every party knows what they're agreeing to and what they're not agreeing to. If that doesn't happen, I don't think there's any reason to go back to this current MOU.
President Trump clearly wanted to get out of this. He wanted to bring an end to the fighting, but it seems as though he's been basically outmaneuvered, hasn't he, by the Iranians?
Well, I think the Iranians think that they have a lot of leverage with the Strait being closed, what it's done to the international energy market. And they probably do politically as we run up to this November election, the midterms. But it's also important to point out there's going to be a day after the midterms. And that's going to go from having some kind of political pressure to President Trump realizing he's not running for office again, and his party isn't going to run while he's still president. So that leverage point, if it is in fact a leverage point, is going to disappear the day after that election, because it's going to go one way or the other. And then President Trump might dig in really hard militarily to try to change the regime as best he can before he leaves office. So this could be going on for a long time.
Mick Mulroy, former US Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East under President Trump. Really good to talk to you this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Carole. Good to be with you.